And so here's the rough agenda. So it's going to be somewhat loose. We're not going to go too wild with being super rigorous about this. And I'm going to try to be mindful of people's time. I'm going to sort of hope for 90 minutes. We'll see if I can get people to stick around that long. If not, you can always start rolling out if you really have to. But I think and then I might stick around for just a little bit longer than that if there's anything going on and people have more questions or anything like that. But if people want to start rolling out around then, that would certainly be fine. Because I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we're going to start with some guest introductions. We have some honored guests here, and I'll have to see who's here. I think I've got a pretty good lineup of guests. Sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. And so then we'll actually, I want to break into I don't want to talk very long. We'll probably have a very short little discussion, maybe some opening remarks from those guests. And if they even want to, if you don't have anything to add or don't feel like you want to make an opening remark, you don't have to. But we'll have to do that. We'll try to get through that pretty quickly because I do want to get to the QA for the primary part of the time, so everybody gets a chance to ask questions. If you stick questions in chat, we'll try to deal with those in the order that they're in chat. So that might be the best way to put your questions is in chat. And then, and that way we'll handle them there. I'm going to be watching on a couple of different platforms. So if you're on Noom Vibe, you can send me a private message. If you're on Facebook, I think it's not working. I'm not going to be able to see your chat. So come over to the Zoom. And that's that. So that's kind of where we're at. And then I keep jumping ahead on that. So then it's too many screens. I can't see all the windows. So then we'll do our discussion. Then we'll have a little short closing. And then, like I said, I'll probably stick around. So again, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to start by introducing some of our guests. I know I saw Zach come in. So Zachary Elwood is here. I think I can find him in the participant list somewhere, even though we have lots of new people coming in. Great turnout, so that's great. We've got a lot of folks here. Yeah, Zach is here. So Zachary Elwood is a former professional poker player. He's author of some popular books on poker tells, and he's also one of the wisest voices on the topic of toxic polarization. And he's the author of How Contempt Destroys Democracy: An American Liberal's Guide to Toxic Polarization. Zach also writes for an organization that we talk about a lot on the show, Starts With Us. And so Zach is here, and it's starting to feel like this is like.
Thank you.
It's starting to feel a little bit like a roast now. I'm going to be like, Samuel Spitale's here. Samuel's, yeah. So, and I saw him come in, so I think he's still there. Yes, he is. So Samuel Spitale has written for many publications and is author of How to Win the War on Truth, an illustrated guide to how mistruths are sold, why they stick, and how to reclaim reality. We had planned to have Dr. Lawrence Eppard. I don't know if Lawrence, are you here? I don't think he made it yet, or if he's going to jump in, maybe he will. Dr. Robert Goucher, I'm pretty sure I saw you join in.
Hey, everybody.
No, yep, you're here. So Dr. Robert Goucher Jr. is a journalist and associate professor, School of Communication and Multimedia Studies, Florida Atlantic University. He edited the book, The Future of the Presidency, Democracy and Journalism After Trump. I saw Guy Burgess join in. I think Guy is here. Yeah, Guy is here. So Guy and Heidi Burgess are PhDs in sociology. They taught at University of Colorado and direct the Conflict Information Consortium. Most of the writing is available free at Beyond Intractability. That's on, I think is that a Substack? The Burgess's current focus is on hyperpolarization. They started a new project called the Construction Conflict Initiative, focused on reducing hyperpolarization and strengthening liberal democracy both in the U.S. and abroad. And Travis Monteleone is here. I'm pretty sure I saw him come in. And Travis is showing up twice. Maybe he's on a couple devices. Travis Monteleone is an associate for LP First Capital. he writes on Substack about toxic polarization from an economist perspective, if I have that right. And his work has been featured by Starts With Us, among others. I believe my co-director Austin Chin is here. I believe. Austin, are you here? Yes, he
Yes.
is.
Hi,
Awesome.
David.
So my co-director Austin Chin is here. Austin is a graduate of Northwestern University with a BA in economics and communication studies, and he was also in debate in Northwestern Debate Society. If you have any questions for him about that, and I don't think I missed anybody, at least any of our main featured guests. There's a lot of invited guests here, and I won't be able to go through everybody, but I really do appreciate you all coming up, and I hope you do give us some questions. Um, I'm looking forward to see what kind of questions we get. We got some good experts here to field those questions. So with that, we'll kind of move on. So I'm going to do a very short presentation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here uh, because I do want to get quickly to the conversation and to the questions. So, the main point here is that we're sort of in a 50+1% world right now, right? I mean, that's kind of the way these elections go these days. So that's what happened in 2020, and it's kind of been what's happening. In other words, at the end of the day, we're a very divided country, and that's kind of the state that we're in. Um, if you look back at the elections over the past 100 years, you can see this chart kind of reads from right to left. So the more recent elections are on the left and 1920s on the far right. And you can see these margins used to be much bigger. You saw these swings, right? So you saw that you see here in the 20s you have the Republicans sort of dominating for a few cycles with large margins, and then after that you see a swing, and the Democrats dominated with large margins, and you see these swings of 20+% sometimes, or certainly in the 15s and higher, or in the teens and higher. And so you see these swings. If you look at the more recent elections, you just don't see that anymore. This is the new world over here from roughly 1990 on or so, and certainly since 2000, the average here is much less. I think the average margin of victory was from 1860 to 1984 was like 10%, and in the election since it's 4%. So it's a pretty big change. We've also had the popular vote, the winner of the Electoral College, lose the popular vote twice in this 20-year cycle from 2000 to 2020, and that did not happen in the 20th century at all, and it had not happened at all in the last 100 years prior. So just some things about elections getting closer and closer, and how we are so divided.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at 2020, it's just like a quick, I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but it's like if you look at 2020 real quick, there's a lot of sort of myths about like what's going on there, and that people sort of think there's somehow have this that there's going to be a new segment of the population that's somehow going to dominate and really help somebody win. And if you really look at what happened, the data, a lot of that mythology doesn't really play out based on the data. Now, these are sort of based on some Pew numbers and all the people that do, and some of the other exit polling is different, or post-election polling is different. They all argue they're the best. Pew says theirs is the best and they show you they make their argument in their methodology. But the real point anyway is just that these elections are really close. Like there's a lot of people think Trump won. I mean, Biden won with, because of, the black vote, right? So if you look at that, yeah, did he get a massive percentage of black voters? Yes, but so did Clinton. So that wasn't really a big change between 2016 and 2020. Same with some of these other segments. What you really see difference here is men. So you saw a big difference. He took a big swipe from Trump between 2016 and 2020 from men, and in particularly white men. So just kind of some ideas about again, the main point just being that these elections really are close, and that there's no real block of voters that's going to just give either party some dominant position for a long period of time, and that I think everything says that the next election is also going to be close. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about that this is from all sides, this is research from all sides, that they, sometimes the left seems to think they have sort of a monopoly on uh, having feeling threats of to democracy. But when these polls are asked people, they both people on the left and the right, perceive threats to democracy. They just are sort of thinking about different things when they're talking about those threats and what they're concerned about. So on the left, we see this list of um, uh, some of the first things people think of are sort of Donald Trump and the January 6th riots. We think of right-wing misinformation, and they talk about limits on abortion, voting, and other rights. Those are kind of how they perceive the threats to democracy. And how the right uh, perceives it is a lot of if I was to break it down to one word, it'd be free speech, but kind of, left-wing censorship, misinformation and media bias, politicized and unaccountable government institutions. I really don't have to read the slide. You can sort of see it all. But the main point is that the right and left view these concerns of democracy differently, but they both see democracy as a threat. And like I said, everything about the upcoming election says nothing's going to change really about how close it's going to be. This is a May polling, and it's May. Everyone says it's early, but I think everything is just showing that unless something happens, this division that we're in isn't really going to particularly change between now and the election, and it's going to be very close. Again, we're in a very divided country, and the idea that either the Republicans or the Democratic Party could somehow build a coalition that would just dominate for decades is a recurring theme in the analysis. And you heard about that if you were able to listen to the episode. We talk about that, and that one of the ideas of the episode is that this dream of long-term political dominance is not only unrealistic, but it's potentially harmful, can lead us to sort of disillusionment and start thinking about undemocratic practices, and it deepens polarization, or it can contribute to polarization. And a better way is sort of fostering a political culture that values um, democratic integrity and appreciates sort of embracing the dynamic nature of politics and realizing that power can shift. So, with all that, I was going to then get some opening remarks from our guests if they wanted to. So, I guess go ahead and do the raise hand thing if you know how to do that, or I guess just chime in and we'll navigate through it if it's somewhat random. Who wants to start? Oh, well, I first wanted to start with our invited guests. So
Oh,
one of our experts, I should say. Like I don't want to call it a panel per se, because I don't want to make it like a major panel discussion. But well, I can just call on one. How about Guy Burgess? Do you have any opening comments for us?
A couple of things. First of all, I think it's not so much that we're evenly divided that's important, it's that we're bitterly divided. And I think one of the real tests of the health of a democracy is not how well the winning party fares following an election, but how much charity they're going to view the losing party. If the losing party doesn't think that they can really live with a defeat in an election, then you get this kind of hyperpolarization and dysfunction that's tearing the country apart. But if you have a kind of political value system where even when you win an election, you realize that you've really got to, in fact, you're obligated to look after the legitimate interests of the losers. And that we've lost. Both sides are pushing for all they can get. There's the old metaphor of the pendulum. Why is it when politics is a political pendulum and the pendulum swings your way, that you pull it as far as you can, forgetting that that means that it's going to swing back even further the other way the next time around? Anyway, a couple of introductory thoughts.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. How about Sam Spatala? You have something for us? Any opening remarks?
yeah. What I noticed with the graph you had up about uh, with the percentages and the change over time, with the polarization, I think it has to be said that, our current media environment, between the demise of the fairness doctrine, the proliferation of right-wing radio, cable news channels, I think to me, are the real underlying issue with the polarization, because what mass media, what's happened with mass media is that it allows all of these people to live in their, different silos. So where, during Nixon's Watergate scandal, for instance, the only news outlets were all saying the same thing. There was no apologists or right-wing propaganda machine, trying to undermine the legitimacy of the investigation. And these days, none of these people have to be held accountable anymore, because they're not reliant on the dominant news outlets to get their voice and word out. So they could keep propagating whatever they want the public to believe on their siloed channels. And so I think polarization is going to be a problem as long as we have media that's allowed to call themselves news media, but in fact not be news. That was my point.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. How about Zachary, you kind of kick it off, and then we'll start taking questions.
Well, I always have a challenge with this because there's just so many directions to go in. So hard for me to give opening remarks or yeah, I think, well, like we talked about in the episode, and like you mentioned, it's a problem when people, I think a big part of the problem of thinking that, we're going to defeat the bad guys, that this kind of mentality on either side of the political divide really is due to, a lot of that to me is due to misunderstanding, distorted perceptions, when you have the most extremely pessimistic views of what the other side believes, what the bulk of them believe, and what their motivations are. When you have really pessimistic and distorted views of your fellow Americans, as many of us do, I think it leads to that amplifies the idea that we're going to defeat them once and for all. It's just a matter of correcting their ignorant, distorted ideas, and then things will be fixed, right? And when you don't understand the more rational and banal reasons driving people's behaviors and stances, it lends itself to that. Whereas if you understand the more rational and banal things driving people's behavior and how they build their narratives, you stop behaving in those kind of we'll vanquish them and we can destroy them and win once and for all ways, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, let's thank you for that. Let's go ahead and open it up. Now, I will say the digital raise hand thing will be a little bit easier for me to find because there's so many participants, a little hard to see everybody at one time. So if you know where that raise hand thing, if it's not one of the options at the bottom or at the top, depending on how your Zoom set up, it should be there with the dots. Oh, I said I was gonna pull them out of chat, didn't I? All right, let me get that chat window where I can see it. Okay. So, okay, we got a bunch of, do we have any questions in chat? Okay, let's see. A lot of folks saying where they're from. That's actually really cool. Good to see that. We got folks from all around. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out how to get the Facebook working still. I only nominally kind of halfway working on that while I do other stuff. Okay, so don't see I don't see a lot of questions. I see a lot of comments. Oh, here's a question. All right. So this is from Ross Yergs. Both Gore and Clinton have admitted to doing things differently than they would have. I'm okay to read this because you sent this direct to me. Why don't you, Ross? Why don't you just tell us what your question is? Are you here?
Hey, gang. Yeah, I just, having studied political science also, and having protected Hillary Clinton, I know they both admitted to wanting to do things differently. In Gore's case, 2000, Hillary's in 2016, than what they actually did. Yet it seems to be the Democrats who are in favor of eliminating the Electoral College. What are your views towards eliminating the Electoral College? Did it do its job in 2000 and 2016 by giving usually middle America its voice? And if you were to eliminate the Electoral College, how would you continue to give the middle America its voice as opposed to just hitting the big major cities that are heavily populated? Thanks, David.
Yeah, so the episode talks about that a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I think if you you know, is the Electoral College working, then if your goal of the Electoral College is to, avoid majority rule, then yeah, 2000 and 2016 showed that it's working. It's definitely achieving that mission. Um, and in terms of changing it, it's highly unlikely. I think in the episode I talk about how there's been 700 or some odd attempts to change the Electoral College, or proposals to change it. And in order to, because it's in the Constitution, in order to change it, you would need an amendment or a constitutional convention. And because of the division that we have, it's pretty hard to get the majority that it takes to make that happen. So unless it's a very broad, appealing item. So since there is, Guy Burgess wants to chime in, so I'm going to do that real quick. But since it's a somewhat divisive issue, getting that kind of majority to change it would be really hard. So even if I wanted to, or even if we think we should, and also Kevin, in the episode, Kevin Smith political scientist Kevin Smith talks a lot about you have to be really careful changing those institutions because you need something to replace it that still deals with the problems that it's creating. So Guy Burgess, why don't you jump up and add on to that? I saw you had your hand raised.
I think you're still muted, Guy.
Sorry. Yeah, I live in Colorado, and mostly the Rocky Mountain West. And something like 75–80% of the land out here is owned by the federal government. And that we're getting to be not as sparsely populated as we used to. But part of the idea behind the United States is that it's a federation of really very different states. And you need some sort of a mechanism to protect sparsely populated states from just getting absolutely overrun by the big coastal population centers. And you drive across Wyoming and see it's all federal land. And basically what the coastal centers decide drives a lot of what happens in that state. So what you need is a balance, and the Electoral College provides some of that. So, this would be a rule change that would dramatically shift the balance of power in ways that favor Democrats. And you at least need to recognize that.
Right. And it's also a reason why it's probably not likely to happen anytime soon. Because that's a very difficult, like I say, there's been a lot of proposals to change it, and none of them have turned into an amendment and made it very far. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Thanks for that. So there's a question, it's kind of a comment, I guess, but it's also a question. If Trump has legal issues pending, why is he able to run again? Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that really stops that from happening. I think you could even be convicted and run and win. The only thing that you can't do is if you were convicted in the Senate for impeachment, I believe. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but that's my understanding of all that. If anybody else wants to chime in on that, but that's why he's able to do it. There's no law against it. Now, I don't know if states could implement their own law. They do have some latitude. Each state has some latitude, but I don't think they would have that much to remove someone from the ballot for that purpose. If anybody thinks I got that wrong, feel free to jump up or chime in. And I think this is a great question from Blake Fisher. Do you think Democrats would be complaining about the Electoral College if they hadn't lost twice due to it? This is part of that question of, I talk in the episode a little bit about how, we sort of think all of the threats to democracy are coming from the Republican side, but there are things that you could say are challenging democratic norms and other things, and certainly when you coming from the left or the Democratic side, and you also see if you look at the data in terms of polling and people's attitudes about undemocratic norms, our democratic norms and violating democratic norms, you'll see the interest in doing that among voters, if not among the elite, is roughly the same. And some of the people that have found those findings have been criticized, but that's what the data shows. And one of their arguments for that is so far the political elites on the Democratic side have not quite been as open to tapping into those pent-up wishes, but the wishes are there. And certainly also you do see some things, and I'm sure some of the more right-leaning people on here tonight could point out some issues where you could say are Democrats participating in, somewhat violations of democratic norms. And again, like, yes, Cameron Cohen notes that that a lot of what holds this together and what have been doing things have been norms, right? I mean, 20 years ago, somebody that was being charged with crimes probably wouldn't have been able to run because, the populace would have they wouldn't have been able to get support probably within their own party. And so that's another norm that sort of has been broken more recently. Next question I see, and if somebody thinks I missed a question, chime in. But from Megan, what would you say to Democratic voters like me who vote in red states like Alabama, because sometimes voting for my chosen candidate and every time gets discouraging, knowing that they will usually still lose? How can eliminating Electoral College help voters like me? Well, I would say that, yeah, this is probably a similar feeling to what a red voter feels like in California or New York State. And it's so we've touched on the Electoral College already a little bit. And as Guy was pointing out, that if you are going to change it, you still need to address some of the reasons why it was put in place. And a straight majority wouldn't address some of those concerns. So what the exact fix should be, maybe somebody has a great proposal for that, but I don't know exactly what that proposal would look like. But something could probably be devised. But again, whether that could get through, it would have to get a very broad appeal that could, generate enough appeal that, because as I noted in that slide in the beginning, one of the threats that Republicans see to democracy are attacks on the Electoral College. So as long as that's a perception there, any changes to the Electoral College probably are going to be difficult. And I don't know if any of our experts want to chime in on that question.
Well,
Yeah,
Go
go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, this doesn't fix the presidential elections, but there are a couple of major initiatives trying to address this problem at the level of congressional and local elections. One is ranked choice voting. There's a group called Rank the Vote trying to push ranked choice voting in a lot of places. And what that does, in effect, is wind up giving minority, if you're a voter in a minority party, you may not be able to get one of your candidates elected, but with a ranked choice voting system, you can have some influence over what candidates from the other party actually succeed in getting elected. Nonpartisan primaries do the same sort of thing. If everybody votes in primaries at the same time, California does this. So California is a blue state, but you wind up with a very blue and a not so blue Senate candidate, which winds up giving red Californians actually a bit of a vote. And I think that's a reasonable way to deal with this problem.
Yeah, and the question would be whether you could get, I mean, I think a lot of people are open to trying that. And again, it's challenging though, because the current model is states have a lot of latitude in that, and it's difficult. I mean, the federal government doesn't tell people. I think you noted this sort of because of the presidential thing, but the federal governments can't force states to do this, so states can kind of decide one by one to do this or not, which always creates some problems. Okay, so I have Blake with his hand up, and I also have questions in chat, and I also have Travis with his hand up. Travis, I think you wanted maybe a comment on one of the questions.
Yeah, some similar thoughts as Guy. I think ranked choice voting is a good solution. One other thing I would just mention is that which states are battleground states changes pretty frequently, and so you could have asked the same question 10 years ago if you were living in Georgia or North Carolina. today you wouldn't have to ask that. Now they're battleground states, and the opposite is true with Florida. Used to be a battleground state, now it's pretty solidly red. So they change every few election cycles, somewhat frequently, just based on demographic trends and obviously the realignment that's going on right now between the parties. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Just because you're in a deep red state today, 10 years from now, you may not be. So.
Right. There's been talk that somehow maybe Texas will start to become more of a swing state, which would be interesting. That's a lot of electoral college votes. Yeah, but I will say that it seems like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania have been sticking around for a long time as swing states. But yeah, that's very true. It's a good point. And Blake, did you have an answer to a question, or were you going to introduce a new question?
Sort of just piggyback on the thing we were talking about with the Electoral
Mhm.
College. I think the thing that I always like to bring up when this gets brought up is that when we talk about the popular vote, it's like talking about, well, this team should have won in the football game because they had more yards than the other team. It's not a measurement of how we measure elections and who wins elections. So the Alabama thing's a great example of that voter might feel like fatigue and not show up because they're like, my vote doesn't matter anyway. That's happening in every red and blue state. So like the popular vote's not really actually capturing what everyone's sentiment is in the country, because there's a bunch of red people in blue states that don't vote. There's a bunch of blue people in red states that don't vote. So the popular vote is not really a good measurement. And I think even looking at 2000 and 2016, when we had these elections where the popular vote didn't match up with the Electoral College, it doesn't matter because we don't really have a real snapshot of what the real popular vote would be if those people had shown up at the polls. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that and I think that raise that makes a good point there, that there really sort of is no such thing as a red or blue state, right? I mean, all of those states have people that on both sides, so, or on all sides. There's independents and others that vote third party and stuff like that in those states too. So yeah, no, there is, but because of the sort of all or nothing of most states, it can feel that way. And I think this is a similar problem to the or it can create a similar sentiment with the gerrymandering, right? So there's been a big increase in the number of so-called safe districts in the country for the House. And I don't know the exact numbers, but it's gone from like half or something like that up to like 80%. And those kind of numbers in that kind of range, something like that. And so it's a big change. And Thomas Zaitsev has one definition of democracy is that it's a place where people can lose elections. And with this many safe districts and a little bit in these so-called red and blue states, it sort of becomes that, right? It becomes this, it's kind of a problem that you can't lose elections in some of these places. So Nimai has a good question. I like this question. I might not be pronouncing that right. I apologize. And it's, yeah, he thoughts on the silent majority. Now, I think that silent majority was sort of a term used a long time ago for sort of a conservative majority, I think, or was it a silent minority? I don't remember. But one term that gets used a lot is the exhausted majority, and sometimes the exhausted silent majority, I think, is sometimes used in some other spins on that. This might be a good question for Zach to take, that, this idea that there's a majority of Americans that are not so polarized. And that's I have a whole show trying to speak to this group, right? So I have some faith that this group exists. And that's what my whole show is kind of speaking to, that audience. But Zach, you wanna tackle this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to I think it's really hard to examine that question because the surveys, when you actually dig into the surveys, it's hard to tell sometimes what exactly is going on. But I do think the surveys show pretty consistently there's a large swath of people that do want to lower the toxicity of divides, and even as I think a good number of those people are also, uh, have unreasonable levels of contempt for the other side and such. But there are on surveys lots of people who say they want to lower the toxicity and think that we can get along with each other a lot more than we do. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but there are a number of surveys that show that. And then the other part of that question was, why does it seem like they're not being represented in Congress? And that's just about the incentives about political leaders and activists, needing to speak to the most polarized and most passionate people, and also, you know, all sorts of other things too, like the most passionate people giving more money and these kinds of things too. So I think there's all sorts of a slew of things there, but probably somebody else has some good take to make on this too.
Austin, you have your hand up. Did you want to talk about this question or something else?
Oh, my question just kind of had to go off of what's being said just about both sides having people who want to lower the temperature versus also politicians from both sides wanting or feeling the pressure to speak to sort of the loudest, most extreme ends of both parties. I don't necessarily know if I have an answer to this. It's more of a question for the panel of experts, but it seems like in the past when politicians on both sides have sort of tried to espouse maybe more centrist ideas that sometimes the base, the more extreme ends, don't necessarily listen. So when Biden talks about bipartisanship and working with Republicans, liberals kind of scoff at that idea. Or when Trump talked about getting vaccinated, he was booed at his own rally for doing that. And so my question sort of is, do we think that our politicians are losing sort of control of this train that they've started? And if so, how do we sort of get them back to a position where, yeah, this train isn't just now running off, and even people from our own side can't convince each other to sort of treat the other side with respect and decency, or to give them the benefit of the doubt?
Guy, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, there's what I call the semifinal effect, that we focus on the final November election. But the election that is in many ways more consequential is the primary election, which may not be an election. It may be caucuses and state conventions and all of that. But I've seen, you know, we cite different sets of statistics, but somewhere around, 60 to 70% of the population are political moderates that are sort of looking for compromises. And there's something like 15%, depending on how you define it, who are folks who are sympathetically called wingnuts sometimes. These are the true believers on the left and the right that are absolutely convinced that their side's got to win. And they're the guys who show up for primaries and caucuses and county conventions, and they have an outsized influence on who actually runs for office. So one of the things that's a bit frustrating about this upcoming November election is there was a group, No Labels, that had managed to get on the ballot a moderate national unity candidate, but they weren't able to get a candidate. And part of that was both parties, the wingnuts in both parties, exerted a lot of pressure so nobody would actually run. And we could have had a third choice, a moderate unity choice, but we don't. But this whole process of how the candidates are selected is critically important and a big part of our problem.
Well, and so you're also saying that that's one of the reasons why the political elites put so much attention on these kind of more extreme, theater that they do to feed that base that votes in the primaries.
Yeah, you can get primary. It's a word that I've been primaried, and you can lose your nomination, even though you're appealing to most of the voters in your district. And in a lot of places, moderates, folks who aren't registered for one party or the other, independents, can't vote at all. And so somehow empowering the middle. I'm on a bunch of Zooms with a guy who's talking about voter suppression of moderates, that there are a variety of rules that wind up giving those in the center less voice than those on the extremes.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. Cameron, you've had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, I think in all of these conversations, I think it's important to think about structures. The sad reality is our Constitution is rather old. We're almost up to 250 years. Um, and as a friend of mine in a pub in England put it to me, it's showing its age. Um, I think we'll have to think. I think in order to solve any of the things that people are talking about, we have to talk about ranked choice voting at a national level. We have to talk about having a multi-party system. Um, we definitely have to talk about, restructuring Congress to accommodate political parties. It was never designed to have political parties. The founders really overlooked that and never fixed it, even though political parties were breaking out as the ink was drying on the Constitution. And all this sort of thing. And there's kind of these big structural things that I think we have to solve in order to um make people happier. And we have now some great guides. What we did in Germany and Japan after World War II de-emphasized the power of the executive in favor of the legislative body. Doing something like that here would definitely curtail the powers of the presidency. um I would like to
Well,
see more power split between the presidency and the Speaker of the House, for example. Australia has another great system. I think to solve any of these issues being talked about, it's time to have some real discussions about how our democracy works at a structural level. And once we're willing to have that conversation in a sane, not crazy way, then I think we can actually address some of these symptoms.
well, and what I'll say to that though is that's a big ask because of the way the system works, those specific types of changes are particularly hard. It was designed to make changes like that pretty hard, pretty difficult. And in order to make those kinds of changes, we will have to find a broad appeal that is going to, I think, be hard in the divided country we have. So it's a challenging problem. I mean, you may be right, but those aren't, we can't just sort of whistle and make that happen, right? Those are very difficult things to make happen. Um,
No, they,
I'm
they aren't. I'm not underestimating the difficulty of that project, but I think too oftentimes in both our national debate and even in this conversation, there's lots of people talking about lots of different small sort of things. And it's like, yes, those are good things to go after and to address. But if we start talking about some big top line stuff, a lot of the small stuff that we're chasing starts to fall away. Like, for example, would presidential elections matter as much if you had more of a power split between the president and the speaker of the house, which become more like a prime minister? No. But the reason presidential elections matter so much is because the presidency has an outsized amount of power and an outsized amount of effect. Even though Congress still controls the money and the legislation, a lot of the policies and things that affect our day-to-day life, especially coming from out west, Bureau of Land Management, EPA, stuff like this, that's all in the executive branch. And so I think there's these different tensions. And so I feel like if we start talking about the big structural issues, we can solve the smaller problems along the way.
well, you're more optimistic about those kind of changes than I am, having worked in this space for a while now. All right, let's get to Travis and Zach real quick because I want to move on. We have a lot of questions in the chat. You want to go ahead, Travis?
Yeah, sure. I'll chime in here. I think everything that's been said is good, but I think one alternative approach is to focus more on the culture and the effective polarization, the tendency for people to really view with vitriol and contempt the other side and really view it as a battle against that other side. I think that fixing that problem on the individual level is the key to fixing all of the other problems. I think the other problems, the media, the politicians, the content that gets created on social media, all of that is downstream from the consumers, the demand, the people at large. And so fixing that contempt, in my mind, is the number one, should be the number one priority. I think that some of the structural, issues that are getting mentioned, a lot of those quote unquote issues have been the case for a long time, and have been the case both in highly polarized times and at times where there hasn't been much polarization in the country. So I don't view a lot of those as the issue. I think that the U.S. Constitution is an extremely flexible document and something that should be held up as a good example of how to create a positive government. It's, you know, the oldest constitution in the world, and I think has been able to weather multiple storms so well because of its ability to be flexible and be changed over time and reinterpreted. And so I don't view you know, the Constitution here as the issue. I think the issue is much more cultural, and, you know, deals with how people at an individual level view each other. And so I think the main thing causing that divide is our negativity bias, which is something I write a lot about on my Substack. And that is just the propensity for people to be attracted to and seek out and pay more attention to negativity instead of, you know, other more positive forms of content or narratives. And so, you know, once people are able to recognize that that is an addiction that essentially we all have to struggle with and regulate, I think that, you know, walking back from that addiction will cause a lot of the downstream effects, like politicians that we produce and political narratives that we engage with, and, you know, media content that we engage with and social media content. All of those things are downstream of our own demand incentives that we're putting out into the world. And so that negativity and pessimism, I think overall is the main thing that drives that. And so if we can pull back from that, I think, you know, a lot of the other polarization pieces will fall into place. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Zach, you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, real quick, because I know you want to get to other things, but regarding the one thing I focus on in my work is recognizing the complexity of the system, right? I think we often there's this tendency to act as if there's like people in power that affect people, and then, you know, they have all the power. But when you actually see how it's an extremely complex system, and the people in power are often given that power by the masses, right? Like, for example, when Austin brought up, you know, Trump being booed for talking about the, you know, promoting the vaccine and such, all of these kinds of incentives in this complex system exist where it's hard to say who has power and who doesn't. But I think when we speak in ways that say, like, oh, this person is responsible, or this group, or, you know, for example, like colleges, some people would say colleges are a factor in promoting, you know, polarization, polarized ways of thinking, or these people, this media group, whatever. I think it's important to see that, you know, it's just a human tendency to become polarized and to get into opposing groups. And no matter what system or people or media or modern technology is being used, those are all just things that humans are using to do what humans do. So I think if you can see the complexity, that's not to say that there can't be things that amplify polarization, that serve to amplify polarization, but seeing the complexity of the system and seeing how, for example, we all play a role in how we engage with each other. I think if more people took that to heart, they would behave in less polarizing ways. And that's a big thing I focus on in my work, kind of examining the complexity of the system and how we play a role, for example, in changing other people's behavior with our behavior and these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So the next question is interesting. It's not a thing that I know this argument gets made a lot. It's not a thing that I've done a lot of research on. So if somebody else, you know, if one of the experts here knows a little bit about this and wants to chime in, it's from Kevin Higgins about the United States government allowing Mexicans to enter the country at the rate it does. Does it have anything to do with votes for Democrats?
I could answer this one.
Okay.
If nobody, so yeah, I actually have some research up on this. So I've written a lot about voter fraud and voter integrity. And so the main thing is that immigrants don't really vote unless they're, you know, they've been integrated, because immigrants are scared of being deported. So all of the talk about immigrants voting is usually just fear mongering and a political strategy. So voting used to be kind of crazy in this country, you know, 100 years ago, but voter integrity the last 50, 60 years has been great. So like we don't actually have a voter fraud problem. There was one study like in 2000 to 2015 or something that found like 9 cases of voter fraud in like 15 years or something. And studies have shown that, we have a greater chance of spying the UFO or getting struck and killed by lightning than finding voter fraud. So just some numbers. Out of the 136 million votes cast in the 2016 election, there were only 4 confirmed cases of fraud, which is 0.000003%. And then out of the 154.6 million votes cast in the 2020 election, there were only 6 cases of fraud. And 4 of those individuals tried to vote twice. The other 2 tried to vote for their deceased mothers, and all 6 were registered Republicans. So it's something that does not happen very often, but the idea of voter fraud is a dog whistle. So it's a political strategy that the right has used whenever too many people of color vote. And so it goes back to after the Civil War, when Black people were first granted the vote. White people were afraid that they would take control. And so the idea of voter fraud first became a thing, a political weapon. And then they passed, poll taxes and literacy tests and all of these other Jim Crow laws that kept Black people from voting. But once the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act went in the 60s, you couldn't ban minorities anymore from voting. And so voter fraud made a comeback. So whenever there are elections where a lot of Black people turn out, like one of the Obama elections, cries of voter fraud make a comeback. And so there have been a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in the Trump years that was a political strategy that was used as a dog whistle. And so it's a myth that's created if the right feels that they're not getting the votes they want. And so it has very little to do with a basis in reality. It is almost always a white supremacy tactic, to put it bluntly. So anyway,
Well,
that's just a few of them.
All right, we're getting maybe a little bit too much into rhetoric. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this question. Zach, do you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, I do want to play devil's advocate there a bit because I think Democrats, liberals should try to imagine how they would feel if, for example, immigrants were more likely to vote Republican than vote Democrat. Like I think it's worth, even if you disagree with the fears there, I think it's worth doing some cognitive empathy and imagining a world in which the more immigrants came to the country, and we're not just talking about like fraud there, we're talking about people, legal immigrants or people who gain immigration legally being more likely to vote Democratic. That's kind of what makes up some of the fears on the conservative side. So I think it's worth going through an empathetic exercise, even if you disagree with those fears or find them even ludicrous. I think it is worth thinking about why those fears exist, why those concerns exist, and just doing that exercise. I think, if you were a Democrat and you knew that the more immigrants were admitted, the more Republicans would win elections, basically. Like those don't require any bigotry. There may be bigotry there, but that basic fear, anything related to which party in a polarized system wins elections, understandably becomes a source of a lot of fear and concern, right? I think that's pretty easy to understand without bringing in bigotry. And I talk about that in my books too. It's a very hard thing to talk about because obviously it's a very contentious and emotional topic, but I do think it's worth bringing some empathy to that. And I think it allows people to speak in more persuasive and empathetic ways when you take some of those concerns a little bit more seriously and don't reach for the most pessimistic framings of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Guy, you want to jump in, and then I think I'm going to move on to the next.
Yeah,
question.
just a very quick comment. The book that made a very big splash a few years ago, The Coming Democratic Majority, talked about how as the makeup of the population changed, Democrats were looking at a lock on power for the foreseeable future. And to a certain degree, viewed from a Republican perspective, that's worrying.
Right. Yeah. Right. It contributes to the polarization. Yeah, I like the next question because I've seen this raised as an example of undemocratic practices from the left. And the question is, would admitting Puerto Rico or Washington, D.C. to the United States help to give them a voice in helping to get like a majority in either the Senate or the House? So I've seen that, listed as a example of anti-democratic behavior on the left. Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, just a couple of quick comments. One is the history of admitting states to the Union has a long history of whenever the party in power needs a few more votes that state's likely to provide. That's one way to do it. There are also, I know, at least in Puerto Rico, very serious internal conflicts over what they want to be, whether they want to be a state. In the District of Columbia, seems like equity demands something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a challenging problem to some degree. But yeah, I was curious, what does anyone have any comments on the idea of those being viewed as anti-democratic? Travis?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, a lot of times it's in the name of representation that people will advocate their statehoods, that they can get, a couple of senators. I've found it interesting, whenever someone advocates for a position like that, to just say, okay, that's fine. We'll allow for Puerto Rico to get 2 senators, but at the same time, we're also going to allow upstate New York to get 2 senators as well, just so that upstate New York is better represented, on the Republican side, since that's how, the majority of upstate New York votes. And so then you kind of get, it's half joking, but you get a pretty good sense of whether or not they're being sincere about their desire for better representation, or if it's just, a ploy to get more Democratic senators into the Senate.
One way to think about this is think about reforms as packages of outcome neutral reforms. So when you total it all up, it doesn't change anything, but it might make the system fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I'm going to move on. And then I'll jump back if we have more on that. But Cameron mentions a great book, The Big Sort. That's Bill Bishop wrote that, and that's a good book to look at. Kind of talks about how we've sorted along many different vectors, geographically and otherwise as well. Another thing that's kind of similar to that, I might suggest, would be like the Bowling Alone book by Putnam. That's an interesting book. We could obviously have a gigantic list. I think probably every guest speaker here probably has a bibliography or a library of books to suggest, and there are a lot of good ones. And there's just a comment about convicts running for president. So this is a good question about trusting the system from Kevin Higgins. How can voters trust the voting system when it is being questioned each year, especially with the 2020 elections and Gore-Bush elections? And trust in institutions is really key to. That I mentioned in the episode, or Andrea Shedler and others have talked about, this idea of mutual respect for these institutions is what makes them hold up. And once we start losing that respect, the house of cards kind of starts to fall apart. So, anyone want to jump in on that question?
I would say, I would say part of that is like when we become hyper polarized, we can be prone to, when we're in conflict, we can be prone to seizing on very pessimistic framings of things, right? Like in a huge country like ours, there's always going to be some things that you can seize on to be like, oh, I'm suspicious about things for X, Y, Z reasons. I think polarization, conflict just makes us more pessimistic. And I think there's often too much of a effort to try to like get people to completely trust something, or I think it's okay to be skeptical. I think the problem comes in when people reach for very confident and certain framings, right? I think that's what we see for a lot of people. It's like it's okay to be skeptical or be uncertain, but I think that the problem comes when we just say we know exactly what happened and we know that XYZ happened, the bad guys did XYZ. So I think kind of encouraging people to vent their skepticisms, but also be like, you know, in a big country, there will often be things that go awry, whether small or big. There's going to be court cases that need to decide things when things go wrong. That's completely normal and expected. And I think trying to encourage people to not take the most pessimistic framings and showing them why the more people take the most pessimistic framings, the more destabilizing it is, and the more polarization increasing it is. I think trying to form those narratives in persuasive ways to people across the political spectrum is important.
I think the system held in the 2000 election. It was a tie election, and it's sort of reasonable to let the Supreme Court decide ties. I mean, it makes more sense than a flip of the coin. And in the 2020 election, there were all of these lawsuits challenging the validity of the election results, and they were all decisively decided in favor of President Biden. The only thing was these January 6 protests, which were soundly put down. There was, I don't think, much of a likelihood that it really would have altered the outcome of the election. The fact that we haven't been able to get a verdict on that event going into this election is the one thing that I do find concerning.
Yeah, and I don't, yeah, for sure. And I don't know if I have an answer to this question, but obviously the big thing that I'd push for is how can we sort of restore that trust? Like, I answered in the chat a little bit that, part of the problem isn't whether the elections are, fair and accurate. It's the perception that they're not due to the affective polarization that we talk about. And once you think they're not, then that kind of starts to be an issue. Um, how can we sort of preserve and support and stand up those organizations in a way that's bipartisan? And again, I don't really have the answer to that. So somebody asked a question about AI. I don't know how much I want to spend on that tonight. Whether AI will have an impact on the upcoming election. Does anybody have any comments on that? Because I certainly come from the tech world and could probably spend 2 hours talking about that, but I don't think I'm going to do that tonight. But I do think it's going to be a factor in all parts of our lives, and the elections are just another part. So Travis says that voter turnout isn't necessarily a good thing on its own, and it's possibly correlated with polarization. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So if you just run a simple correlation between historical electoral outcomes, so the ranking of all the different presidents that we've had. C-SPAN has a really good presidential rankings survey where they ask, I don't know, a couple hundred, I think, historians and other political scientists how they would rank the presidents. And if you compare that ranking versus voter turnout, since the beginning of the country, there's actually a negative correlation, funny enough, between voter turnout and the quality of the president who's elected. So I know that's just a single election out of all the many elections we have, but it's clear that, or it's an interesting question of why it's not the case that there's an obvious positive correlation between higher voter turnout and better electoral outcomes, and that evidence doesn't really seem to exist. So that's kind of a weak relationship. What's a strong relationship is that as voter turnout increases, polarization is typically higher as well. And so that is pretty well attested in the literature, and it makes sense. Whenever polarization is high, people think, well, I really need to turn out to vote, because if the other side wins, my world as I know it is going to fall apart, and that's no good. Whereas if polarization is lower, people are less worried about whether or not they go and vote. So whenever people say that, we definitely need to increase voter turnout at all costs, or, are celebrating a high voter turnout, that's not necessarily always a good thing. I think in general, people should vote when they want to, and when they feel that they've, got a political opinion to express, but we should not be guilting people into voting. And, if we see a high voter turnout one year, that might just be because people are extra polarized, and we would rather have less polarization and a lower turnout than more polarization and higher turnout. So just something to keep in mind there. It's somewhat counterintuitive about voter turnout.
Awesome. Thanks. So Warren talks about or asked why we don't make voting compulsory, and Blake answered that probably a First Amendment question there. And I'm not even sure that's a good idea, but I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that. But there's also the other question that's kind of semi-related of sort of compulsory or automatic registration. Some see that as another anti-democratic move that's happening in some places. So I'm curious if anybody wants to comment on that before we move to the next question. But thanks for that question, Warren.
I think one big issue that we haven't talked about is voter responsibility. If you're going to vote, you ought to take it seriously. I wind up spending, 8 hours or something for each major election trying to research all the things that I'm voting on. And a lot of people don't do that. And I won't say who it was, but I knew somebody who was driving around the university campus in a golf cart on election day looking for students who hadn't voted, and hey, we need you to vote right now, we'll take you to the polls. But they hadn't thought about it at all, and I'm not sure that produces better outcomes.
Well, and that's something that a lot of people joke about, that often these independent voters that seem to be the ones that do a lot of this swing state stuff are these least informed voters.
It's also true that the least informed voters are much less partisan
Right.
than the highly informed voters.
Right. Yeah, so let's see. We're getting down here. We've got to try to hold to our time. We're running out here. I might start picking and choosing some questions. I don't know how to frame this. This is from Danielle. I don't know how to frame this into a complete question, but I have not heard voting fatigue explicitly stated in this discussion, but I feel like it's a big factor. And I guess that kind of relates to, so do you have, what about voter fatigue? It seems like that kind of relates a little bit to this idea of feeling like your vote, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but feeling like your vote is sort of wasted, quote unquote. I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts on that. Zach?
Yeah, I in Ezra Klein's book Why We're Polarized, which I wasn't a big fan of, honestly. It was his book that led me to work on my books because I wasn't a big fan of his. But I did agree with him at the end when he talked about when he talked about things we can try to do to reduce polarization. One of the things he said was, we spend so much attention, we focus so much attention on these national politics that we have very little influence over, which is part of the reason we feel frustrated and kind of adds to polarization. We give it so much mental attention. We vent online, which can be an increase in just adding to polarization without doing much too. So he talked about focusing on more local things where you actually have some influence, as opposed to focusing so much on national things as a way to work on things you think are important and actually have an influence. And I thought I agreed with him on that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Chris Jerome mentions the book Love Your Enemies by Arthur C. Brooks. I don't know if anybody has any quick comments on that one. And Travis Bolo talks about demonization of the other has taken over political discourse. That's certainly something we talk about a lot. And it at least seems that's the conversations that we see. Now, sometimes we have to remember that even that is a skewed perspective on the world, right? Because those loud voices are the ones that are participating, and sometimes the folks that don't feel that way have sort of left those conversations and sort of self-silent. So even that sometimes is a misperception because that's what we see, especially on social media.
There's a game theory problem that it's much easier to build a political coalition around hating the other guy than putting together a positive agenda for your party, because that involves compromises and people not getting what you want. But if you can inflate the threat posed by the other party and only talk about that, then elections get decided on that. And nobody ever has to come up with a program for governing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Well, then that's kind of where we're at to a degree, right? It's a lot of theater and
Sadly.
not much governance. Um, so Dave Kenyon, right, asks about there's a lot of talk of voter being denied the right to vote. Is that true? Well, certainly there's the conversation of voter suppression, and I guess the question is, does that happen? And I don't want to get too partisan here if we've got a nice reasoned answer to that question. Because that's the kind of conversation that can spin out of control pretty fast, I think.
Yeah, I actually just typed something as a response in the chat, which answers some of that.
Okay, and Blake, you had something to say on that?
I was just going to say the most recent example that I saw looking at this was Georgia, where there was all these claims of voter suppression with the laws that they did in 2020. And when there was a group that tried to sue the state for voter suppression and stuff, they could not find one person that said they wanted to vote and couldn't vote. So they couldn't even find a plaintiff to bring the argument. I know that's one state, but I think that kind of like on the right side, the thing of like there's massive voter fraud. The massive voter suppression thing is the left's version of that I think is kind of a fairy tale. I think, you look at polls, most black voters also want there to be voter ID. So it doesn't seem to be racist. I don't think that that's a fair claim, but that's just the most recent one. 2020, Georgia couldn't find one person that said they were disenfranchised and couldn't vote and they wanted to. So I think that's a good example of that's not happening, just like voter fraud's not happening.
Well, and some of the examples of things like closing polling stations and stuff like that apply to both the left and right as well, right? You have Democrats and Republicans doing that when they can. I mean, it's a tactic, and they sometimes use it. So you do see those things happening where polling stations get closed, which is a little bit hard to measure that. Whether it's, but yeah, like you say, they couldn't find anyone. But that's interesting. I didn't know about that. Leland talks about. Oh, Zach, did you want to jump in there?
I also think, it can be valuable to understand the way that conflict works, even if you think the other side is doing XYZ bad things. I mean, there's often this tendency for everybody to be like, those guys are doing really bad things, therefore anybody that supports them is really bad. But it's like the nature of conflict, even if you perceive bad things being done, the nature of conflict is like when we feel we're in a good versus bad battle, we're not really that concerned with like the bad things that may or may not be happening on our side. We're much more focused on the threats we see from the other side. So that's just to say, I think there's often this like morality thing where we're like, they support XYZ, so everybody that is in their group is morally bad for those reasons, right? But I think trying to be a little bit more empathetic and be like, the bad things that you perceive, whether they're there or not, it's like not everybody in that group is condoning that, right? They're thinking about like what are the threats I see from the other side, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really pleased with the questions that we've had here tonight and the participation. I mean, it's just been fantastic. I really appreciate it. So Leland mentions some things about dollars. It's not really a question, but I'd be interested to see a chart of dollars spent on elections, inflation adjusted versus margin of win. I have researched some of that, but I do not have any of those numbers kind of readily at the top of my head to put out. But and I probably don't have a lot of time on that. But if somebody has a quick comment on that, I'll look for another question. A little bit of comment about Puerto Rico, and that they say that oh, this is Jörg's talking about Puerto Rico is politics is a major league sport. um, um, oh, so let's see here. A lot of comments, not that many questions.
David, did you want to talk about like solutions? I don't know if that was something you wanted to get into, like ideas for practical things that we can actually do.
Yeah, let's do that.
Not, I mean, I wasn't I wasn't sure if you wanted to. I don't have a strong opinion whether you should. I just was curious if you.
Well, I mean, it's always something listeners are looking for. But the biggest challenge I always find with this is a lot of us kind of want that, the one that we don't have to work hard at. We want a nice, quick solution. And most of these problems aren't going to be solved that way. And a lot of it is also looking at ourselves, as Guy and a lot of us talk about often. And a lot of us don't want to do that either.
Well, the one solution that Heidi and I have been pursuing is something we call massively parallel democracy building. And it's not like it's our strategy for that we want everybody to adopt, but what it is a word to describe the and really millions of people that are involved in trying to fix democracy in one way or another. We have some things on our Substack newsletter that explain a lot of this, but they're literally, we've identified like 50 or 60 different roles where people are working to strengthen democracy. And there are thousands, if not millions of people working in all sorts of different ways. And once you get a sense of just how many things people are doing, it's a source of some real optimism. It's not hopeless. One of my biggest source of optimism in the world is all problems create opportunities for people who can figure out how to solve them. This is what underlies the invisible hand. It underlies the modern economy and the wonders of the modern world. And it also applies to the political system. And there are lots of people trying to figure these problems out, and there are opportunities to help them.
And David, I can't actually remember if we talked about this when we talked for your episode. I'm pretty sure you didn't include it in the episode, but if I forgot it, I should have mentioned it. I thought that when it comes to solutions, I really like Dan Stone is the author of Undue Hate, a book which is really good, I think, about polarization. But he's been talking about the idea for basically like a Manhattan Project for polarization, which would just involve getting people together, talking about ideas that would be broadly applicable or appeal to a broad swath of conservatives and liberals as a way to investigate like what could be done for people that across this political spectrum who do want to lower the anger. And I think the interesting thing in there is so many people talk about polarization as one of our biggest problems, or if not the biggest problem, but like so few political leaders actually do much to solve it or even speak in depolarizing ways. And I think that it's kind of understandable to me why why that doesn't happen, because in order for someone to talk about like, well, let's work on polarization, let's try to depolarize it, in order to do that, you're indirectly saying, well, I think there's something for my group to work on. And so that's an obvious reason why politicians, political leaders don't do that. So I think that's a big part of making progress on this is trying to show to politically influential people, activists, leaders, why this is important to work on, and aiming those messages at people that need to hear it. But of course, it's very difficult for the incentives that we've talked about. But I think the more that we try to make the case to political leaders in whatever way we can to show them, talking about polarization doesn't mean you can't still work hard for your political beliefs. So you can, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean you're saying both sides are the same. You can keep thinking the other side is worse or contributes more. So I think trying to make those persuasive messages as much as we can is important, which I think gets into the importance of like cultural change efforts, speaking to people to get those messages out there and have them spread throughout society more.
Yeah, I mean, I could obviously talk about this subject for a long time, so I probably shouldn't even start, because we have a whole podcast about that, 50 some odd episodes. But, but yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the challenges is scaling, right, and scaling that up, and there's a lot of people working on those kind of problems as well, including some of you folks here with us tonight. Yeah, anybody else have any thoughts on, ideas that could improve things? I mean, we talked a little bit about civic education. All these things I'm for all of it, but I mean, those are all hard things to scale too. And also there often isn't a lot of appetite for a lot of these things. So, Nimai, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, this is sort of this is a really difficult bar to sort of meet in practice, but something to just I try to keep in the back of my mind. Definitely don't always do it, but it's just an idea that if you find yourself in a situation where you're discussing these kinds of topics and you find like you sense you may have some disagreement with someone, like practicing this habit of trying to articulate to the best of your ability their point of view first. It's like, here's how, like, this is how I understand, how you're thinking about it or how you're seeing it. And not just like rattle off bullet points, but like get into the sort of emotional valence of it too, to the best of your ability. And like, okay, like I can see it from that perspective, and then try to say where you differ or where you think your understanding of things is a little bit different. Like I've seen that in practice, like diffuse things from time to time. I think a lot of times people feel like they're just not being heard, or this other person is like sort of directly assaulting their reality or their understanding of reality in some way. Whereas if you can establish like, no, I understand you see reality this way, and it's fair and it's legitimate, but maybe I see this a little bit different, or I think you're exaggerating this. It's more laborious, but if you can make that like an ethic or a practice, try to make that a habit, I think the more people who do that, the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and Megan raises this in the comments about how do I have, as a young Democrat, how do I have a conversation with my conservative parents? And obviously, we could have a whole nother five QAs about that. But a lot of it starts with listening, right? I mean, I do something I call these street outrage interviews, where I talk to folks across the political spectrum and generational spectrums and others, and I put myself in a listening mode. So it's setting the intent to listen and not react or comment or not push back. And you really see a change in how people discuss things after a little while, when they realize you aren't pushing back and you aren't, reacting and to their statements. And they really open up and start telling you more. Now, you may not want to hear some of the stuff they're going to tell you too, though, right? So you do have to really put yourself in that mode with intent, and then decide where to go from there. But there's a lot of folks like there's organizations you can look at for sort of practicing some of this. Crossing Party Lines is one. Braver Angels is another. And these take effort to go learn some of these skills, because they are learned skills. These aren't our innate properties. We come to find out, right? Humans are much more want to react and want to make our point, get our point across, and that kind of stuff. So we're going against some of our natural tendencies, but these are skills that can be learned. And if it's somebody close to you, like your parents, it can be a little harder, right? It's a little easier for me in these street outrage interviews, because these aren't necessarily close, people that are super close to me. And sometimes it is, and that's fine too. But sometimes, but if it's your parents, you might be more concerned about them if you think they have dangerous views or scary views or whatever, and you might really want to change their views a lot,
that's not true.
a lot more intensely or something. But yeah, that's the best thing that I could suggest in the beginning, is really put yourself in listen mode and build that trust first, and really get them, like Nimai was just saying, gonna get that trust up where they feel safe, expressing their views, and that they won't be attacked.
Yeah, I think you could go a step further and open yourself up to the possibility of being persuaded.
Yep.
You can't just go into an interaction wanting to straighten somebody out and persuade
Right.
them that they're wrong. You have to listen with the intent of actually changing your mind.
Right. What if they change your mind? Yeah. Yeah. That's a hard one.
But what if they won't do that towards me?
Well, and
I'm
that's
trying my best, but what if they won't?
well, and that's a decision you have to make, right? Because if you're the one
Yeah,
who's sort of done
exactly.
some of this training, and you're the one ready to do it, you have to. It might not be a fair, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term, sort of a fair fight at first, because you're going to be doing all the trust building at first, and
Mhm.
you're going to be doing all the listening, perhaps. But it's really up to you to decide whether you're prepared to do that. And a lot of these
Mhm.
conversations do require some good faith from both sides. But if you want to put in the effort, they might begin to turn around and they might not. Like, it's not a guarantee. There's no guarantees here. But as you take on that burden, and you have to decide if you're comfortable with that you take on the burden of being the listener for a while, and not,
Mhm.
winning any arguments or whatever, or even trying to have an argument. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
also, I mean, yeah, I think it's up to everyone to, how much they'll put up with people that are
Right.
being rude to them, right? Like that's always a personal choice. But I also think also with a lot of these discussions, even sometimes when we're trying to have a respectful conversation, there can be accidental ways we trigger other people by the, and I think being curious about that and if it seems like something if it seems like something's going along well and then all of a sudden somebody's angry, like if it seems like they're otherwise trying a good faith thing, ask them. You could even ask them like, well, what bother you? And sometimes you might find out it was something that you were saying that you didn't realize comes across as kind of condescending or conceited. I see that a lot on both sides where people are actually trying to have a well-meaning conversation and just aren't able to do it because they have a lot of blind spots. Yeah.
Well, and there's a lot of issues around language that sometimes we're not aware that some of this language has maybe been sort of co-opted or something, for lack of a better term. And you don't kind of realize it because you don't appreciate that meaning of some of those words too, and that can cause that to happen as well. Well, I
One
wanted
other thought is
yeah,
that
go ahead.
treating people with respect doesn't cost you anything, and it builds relationships that may lead to change over the long term. The other thing to remember is if you're having a conversation with someone, and especially if you're in some way challenging their views, you need to remember that you're challenging a huge number of interactions that they've had, both things they read and listen to, and people they've talked to. And you're not just saying, this, you're wanting somebody to give up on or decide that they don't believe really their whole friendship and support network. And that's a very hard step for people to take. And you need to be patient.
Yeah, for sure. And one social scientist I spoke with said that the equals MC square equivalent of social science is that social death, people are more afraid of social death than physical death. And I think that's a powerful thought. Yeah, so I wanted to respect everybody's time. So we're at the 5:30 here on the West Coast, and I wanted to acknowledge everybody that and some of the other folks that participated in the that aren't here but participated in the episode. So there's the Connors Institute. That's our partner, and they have a documentary out. You can find it at connorsinstitute.org. That is a documentary called "The Poisoning of the American Mind" for folks that are interested in news literacy, misinformation, things like that. Zach has a book, looks like this, How Contempt Destroys Democracy, Liberals' Guide to Toxic. And you have another book as well, Zach, the one before this, but this is, I think, your newest book, right?
Yeah,
And
the previous one was only an ebook because it was way too long and meandering. So.
Okay. And then you can find those at that website that I have there, AmericanAnger.com. And then some of the folks that participated in the episode, Kevin Smith, Sean Evans, Thomas Seitzoff, and Andreas Schedler. Those were folks that I all had an opportunity to help on the episode. And I wanted to say that I wanted to leave with a couple of quick links and a thank you. And then anybody that does want to stick around, we can stick around. I mean, any of the experts that say, hey, you stuck it out this long, I really appreciate it. If you want to roll off, that's fine. I might stick around if people have any more questions for a while. And if not, we can all roll out. But I wanted to make sure everybody felt comfortable just giving up. And I saw really impressed with how many folks stayed. And I also really impressed with the questions. What a really great set of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. So there's a little survey. I will probably email this out so folks can take that survey. I'd really appreciate if you did that. And then as the last note is I got to do this one because if somehow we have to keep doing the work that we're doing. So if you're so inclined, you can buy me a coffee at that top link at buymeacoffee.com/outrageoverload, or you can subscribe and otherwise contribute at outrageoverload.net/contribute. And I do appreciate all the support that we get. That's how we keep the show going, and it's also how we manage to keep the show ad-free. So with that, I would say anybody that wants to stick around, I will still hang out, and I will thank once again all of our esteemed experts that really gave some expert answers to all those questions, and really, I thought it was a very engaging conversation, and I think that I'm really pleased with the with that, and also with the, like I said, the participation from the audience. So thank you. And the biggest support is talking about the show, listening to the show, showing up here tonight. That's the biggest support you can do for us. But if you wanted to go above and beyond, here's a couple of options. So with that, I will say thank you again. And if you want to jump off, feel free to do that. If you want to hang out, I will hang out for a while. And I think if it's only going to be a few people hanging out, we can probably just raise hands or jump up with any additional questions. And thanks again to all you experts. I really appreciate you sticking it out here for 90 minutes.
Thanks so much, David. I got to take off, but thank you.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks for answering my questions. Gotta go.
Okay, take care. Thanks for participating.
Thanks, David. I was just going to send you an email that I didn't say a word. I
I
think
saw
I'm
that.
I think I'm much more pessimistic than the majority of the people on the call as a cultural studies scholar, and under the CIA level scrutiny of the Republican government in Florida as a state employee. I was, it's better if I answer direct questions than give critique without people asking. But yeah, I mean, I guess if I had a question, and I love that the podcast and everything is focused on solutions and whatnot. I mean, but I wonder. I've just never been a fan of the excuse me, optimistic view, which is very sad. But we have something in journalism called solutions journalism that is trying, but is still using very white, very elite, very liberal and left perspectives on issues of social justice and expectations of society. So I guess if I did have a question, maybe to help me, being selfish, but is what do we do with pessimism? Has everybody has everybody written off pessimism? And I mean, none of us are speaking, it seems to be from a jail cell. None of us seem to be speaking under the threat, but threats of abuse look very different, right? And so we could actually, we all are sitting under the threats of abuse. I'm in a military state in Florida, right? So I don't know what value my pessimism.
Well, I'll say that when I spoke with, and I've spoken with Peter Coleman several times, but when I think I first spoke with Peter Coleman, who obviously works in this space a lot, starts with us and other organizations, and he said, "Well, this is not always satisfying work. It can be
Right.
it can be a challenge, and you
Right.
you have to have some self-care if you're in this space, and he also sort of admits that we don't really know how long we're going to be in this state that we're in, how long it's going to last, or a lot of people struggle with what those off ramps are and how you get there. And so it is nice, to see, but it is nice to see so many folks working on it, the Burgesses and the stuff they're doing. And that's a great resource, by the way. They also give a lot of, update a lot of links and things from all over the place. So it gives you a lot of sort of a big picture of what all is going on out there. But yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in. That's the first things I thought of when you were speaking. I mean, Travis or Sam, maybe.
Yeah, I can just say briefly that that's the main thing that I write about is why is it the case that people are so negative and that there's so much pessimism in the world. I just sent a link to a good Vox article that shows why there's so many reasons to be optimistic about how great the world is and how much better things have been getting. And you can find those charts and stats and that data anywhere on the internet. Steven Pinker, Max Rozier, Hans Rosling. I mean, these writers are out there talking about how much progress we've made, a dime a dozen. And the stats are incredible, right? In the last 200 years, the percentage of the world that is living in extreme poverty has shrunk from 90% of the world down to 10%. I mean, that is an economic miracle, the likes of which we've obviously never seen. And that type of incredible progress can be seen across any number of different metrics, whether it's, poverty, lifespan, education, literacy, you name it. But despite all of that, people love to focus on the negative and the pessimism. And so my question is essentially, why is that the case? And my answer is negativity bias. I think that that's the main driver of overly pessimistic narratives, and I think also of polarization in America, that people just crave that negativity, that even though the world, may be getting a lot better and it's great by all these metrics, people don't care about that. They won't pay attention to it. They don't, enjoy reading about it or listening to it. They want, if it bleeds, it leads. That's, what people are attracted to. So I think that bias is, an incorrect way to view the world, that people kind of have a negativity goggle on. And a more accurate way to view the world would be to take those negativity goggles or blinders off and view the world, for what it is. And that's, a vastly improved place than it was, 120,
Yeah, I mean,
200 years ago.
No, I appreciate that. It's still just slaps of an elitist sort of not your this idea of I'm glad people are living longer sort of thing, right? I maybe it's from studying cultural theory and none of those people were really maybe happy with their mothers or something. They had bad childhoods or something, but I think that I'm using a secular word of pessimism, right? Because of how we kind of are talking about things in our society here, right? It's very very anti-intellectual, right? The way that we talk about structures and politics. It's always a social politics sort of thing. I think it's that critical lens, right? I think it's being critical. And when I'm working with my students, they, David, you mentioned everybody wants to go to the solutions, right? But we want to go to the solutions because we don't want to actually identify what the problem is. And in order to identify the problem, it's to have a critical lens. And a lot of the students then leave the class being like, well, why the hell did I just sit through that? Now I feel bad about myself. And so I do think that you're right, that there's a sentiment, right, that is certainly one that we can't avoid and that we pick up on, and that we subscribe to, right, because it's so venomous. But I just think that critical intellectual lens is really lacking, and we see it when states and governments are cracking down on it left and right, about us even being able to talk about it. So, but no, I appreciate your answer. It's still kind of, it's still absent.
Well, you can,
of
both
that.
things can sort of be true, right? I mean, we can
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
overestimate and we can overestimate the negative and still have some actual negative. And one thing I'll say to that is, and for those that are still around, and this is going to be a really weak psychological analysis here, but we've talked about negativity bias a lot in the show, and I'll just summarize it to say it's a sort of an innate tendency of humans, and that we think it's sort of maybe I shouldn't say we think, but the scientists think that it's kind of perhaps part of our evolutionary biology, and it was there to like maybe protect us, right? Because you needed to worry about the thing that was going to kill you and stuff like that. And you can see it in yourself really easily if you think about like a performance review at work, right? If you had 10 great things they said, you were excellent, awesome, awesome, awesome. You get one where they say needs improvement. What's the one you're going to focus on and worry about and think about? It's the one where it needs improvement, right? You're going to almost discount the ones where that said you were great. So it's part of it's just part of how humans work. I know Kevin has some different thoughts here, so I did want to see if we have time for that. So maybe a different perspective on this. Go ahead, Kevin. You're muted.
Yeah, when you talk about the lenses, I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I represent, what I'm saying, the African American culture side of things. And how y'all seeing it, I feel like y'all seeing it from y'all's point of view. There's two sides. I'd say that everything is negative, and what was y'all saying, that the thought process of what's going on is all negative. The energy is negative. Why is like that? Because of what we're seeing. We live in this. First of all, it's to the point where it's like the United States isn't a country, because the country cares about its citizens, we the people, and constitution rights and all that other stuff. What it's more like, it's like a corporation. And that's why personally I feel that Donald Trump is, right for the job, because you need a businessman to run a corporation. The United States is all about money, 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 money. What can we get out of y'all? And then you look at the inflations of life, how everything that went up after COVID, they're not even caring about the wages are going up. They're still the same. So it's all a business thing. And the aspect of the negative energy that people are seeing, a pessimist is the word y'all was using. The pessimist is valid because of what's going on in society. Now, being who I am and going through what I'm going through and being on this planet for 50 years, it seems like it's just a disregard for those that are kind of like irrelevant. Like our Black people are kind of irrelevant for whatever reason. And for it to be the way it is, there's a lot of, people are starting to see, like the young guy said, this is a new world. This is the new world that we're entering, and that old thinking has to get out. That's when the change. We want to talk about solutions. That's when the solutions are going to kick in, when we get this new mindset, because it's out with the old way of thinking and in with a new way of thinking. And until things start changing in the direction of what a country's supposed to be going in, then it's going to be pessimist human beings that's not believing in the system, thinking that the system is rigged over and over. It's the same thing. The system is not broken. That's what a lot of my people think. The system is broken. No, the system is working the way it's supposed to be, but it needs to be broken down and, rebuilt into a more of a system that is going to benefit the people of the United States. So there's reasons for people to be pessimists about, the future. There's nothing to really look forward to because everything is we're in 2024 and ain't much serious changes have been made. We're still in the bucket of where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago, but slowly processing the step towards, something much greater. Why? Because a new way of thinking is coming into office. So I say that the pessimism is awarded because of the actions that we see.
Okay. All right, Warren, I know you've had your hand up for a while. Thank you, Kevin.
Oh, hi. Thanks. So I wanted to come back to something, I think it was Travis said. The negativity bias is a universal human phenomenon. The internet is worldwide. Another thing people often blame for the sorry state we're talking about today. So those sort of things can't, in my mind, explain why the US is such an outlier in terms of the degree, not the phenomenon of, but the degree of sort of fear and hate-based polarization. Seems to me something really did change uniquely in the US, 30 to 40 years ago. That was the beginning, I think, and it's just accelerated since then. And the word I give for it is echo chambers, enabled largely by the removal of the fairness doctrine and the media ownership consolidation regulations. But I'd like to hear, I know Sam has mentioned that before, but I'd like to hear if anybody else has comments on that. Thanks.
Well, before we take it, I'll just, with some of the stuff that I've learned so far on this is, I do think that's an overly simplistic view a little bit. I mean, echo chambers are clearly a factor for sure. And but there's a lot of factors. I mean, and media consolidation, and also another factor there is the fact that a loss of local journalism, right? That's been a big factor to it as well. So now we get way more focused on these national issues than we probably should be, because we don't really have local journalism here telling us what's going on in the school board and what's going on in our local towns. So we just fight over the stuff at the national level that often we don't have much impact. We can't do much about, and also sometimes it doesn't affect us as much. So I will say that this is a little bit of the it's the echo chambers in the library with the candlestick kind of simplification, right? It's a bit more complicated than that. And there's another question about whether echo chambers are a cause or a symptom, right? Did we get polarized and then go into echo chambers, and I think it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, I think the reality is it's a bit of both. But go ahead, Travis.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's an interesting response. I think another differentiator with the U.S. is that the U.S., just happens to be the most powerful country in the world and has been, since World War II. And so even though the internet is ubiquitous and negativity bias is ubiquitous, the stakes in the U.S. are just a lot higher than other countries, and so it would make sense that people would, get a lot more invested in it, just because what happens to the U.S. Affects the world much more broadly than what happens in any other given country. There's the old joke that the Brits know more about American politics than Americans do, and that's because what happens in the U.S. is so impactful around the world. And then what I would also say about the fairness doctrine and the media, I think if you were to have a perfect media landscape, it would be one in which you have a lot of different media companies, and that they are generally free to report the news as they want. And if they want to have a partisan bent, then that's their right. And people should be able to enjoy that news if they want. What we need to do is not, in my mind, regulate top down how the media industry should operate, but we should, from the bottoms up, encourage the public who is consuming this product to consume it responsibly. And so it's similar to the alcohol industry, right? If we wanted to fight alcoholism, the government could come in and say, okay, no more alcohol. We can't produce it anymore. We did that, and it didn't work very well. The only real solution, because we all agree that some people can and should be able to enjoy alcohol responsibly. The solution is from the bottoms up to try and get people who are susceptible to alcoholism to regulate their consumption. And we should be doing the same thing, in my mind, with negativity. We should be viewing it as a low-level addiction, that some people can read partisan news and enjoy that, and that's fine, that's their right. But if it's going too far and it's causing them to lapse into some type of crazy partisan a state similar to an alcoholic, then that type of behavior we should encourage to be regulated. That negativity consumption should be regulated at the individual level, not at the government level.
Well, I'm all for educating and news literacy. Obviously, that's a big part of what our partner Connors Forum works on, our Connors Institute works on, and also what we talk about. But I do think that it's not by itself, it doesn't necessarily solve things out. And Warren, you might actually be interested in episode I did with Sanjay Jolly, which talks about C. Edwin Baker and some of his ideas. And one thing that Baker talked about, he was a legal scholar who's put a lot about media and First Amendment and other things. But he talked about how the First Amendment is not just about preserving rights to access to thing, but it's about enabling the access and good information too. So there's a responsibility of the nation to ensure that we have broadly represented information. So he talks about the idea of we should, at the federal level or at the government level anyway, be funding much more of this so that every community has good journalism and good community. And this would speak a bit to what Kevin was talking about too, right? And because there's a lot of underserved areas out there that do not have much journalism and much local or quality information in their area. And so that's another spin on it too. I think there are things we could do if we had the appetite for it, and they're completely within the rights of the First Amendment to, and he didn't mean just sort of give NPR 10 times more budget, which is probably not a bad thing, because compared to other countries, we do not invest in that to the degree we should. But he was talking about more proactive things. So there's a proactive side to the First Amendment. Kevin, did you have more to add to this? Yeah, Dave. I finally got it working on Facebook. It only took me like an hour to figure out where the right buttons were. Yeah, that's a weird interface. I'm telling you, if you don't do that regularly, that's a tough one. Well, okay, so Nimai, did you want to jump in?
I think Kevin unmuted. I don't know if he has something.
Oh, Kevin. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, well, like you said, people are not being responsible. Great power. I know in Spider-Man, one of the movies, he said, "With great power come great responsibility." and they're not being responsible with the power that they have. They're manipulating and controlling the narrative, which is being pushed out on a negative aspect. You know, if all we're hearing and seeing is negative things, it's kind of hard for a person to be optimistic about change in the near future when it's just been consistent over and over. Because those, like for example, I don't understand. Now I'm new to all this. I don't understand why a senator, a judge, or a congressman can or woman can be in office for so long, but the president, who's supposed to be the leader of the free world, correct? That's his title. He only gets 4 years. So let's just say, like Ohio State football has always been at the top. Why everybody else failed? Why? Because they keep replacing the, you know what I'm saying, putting the right person in the same in the right situation and allowing the system to, you know, continue doing what it's doing. If I'm the president and I got 4 years and the prior president had 8 years, how long is that going to take me to get that together and then put my own thing in? How I'm going to take over a country, not a country, but how I'm going to take over a football team, a program where I gotta only got a certain amount of time and to put my own thoughts and put my people in position, because this coach, John Cooper, he had the Ohio State's Buckeyes for about, you know, 8 years. So I only got a certain amount of time. The president only got 4 years. I don't understand that. Like there's things as far as my people are concerned, that we don't understand things in the politics, in the politician world, such as y'all do. Y'all more in that with it, where we're just blind. And all we got to go for is, you know, the internet or the news, which is being irresponsible with the power that they have, is giving us information. So a lot of us have strong reasons to be a pessimist about it, because, like I said, with great power comes great responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Nimai?
I I don't know, I'm just kind of responding to and frankly, you know, Kevin, I also, you know, have no idea what's going on in like the halls of power. I'm also just kind of like, you know, it all does seem very distant from the ground. But uh uh I don't know. Like there's always this tendency to try to like do a root cause analysis, right? Like what is the root problem? Like Warren says it's the echo chambers. You know, some people will say, you know, other kinds of things. And I keep coming back to I think it's like a cultural. I think there's like some deep. I don't know what it is. I have a friend who says we have like a togetherness crisis in America, and that's kind of a corny sounding thing, but there's like a lack of like just I don't know, like people like being together with one another. You know, does that make sense? Does that sound kind of corny? I don't know, but
Well, and that comes
um,
and that's talked about a bit in some of those books that were mentioned, like the
yeah,
Bowling Alone Putnam book talks about that.
yeah, like you know, so my family's from India, and I remember I was listening recently to something, and there's some like old text from like India, like way back in the day, where you know some there was some whatever kingdom or something, and they had their code of ethics, and it was like it was said in one of those things that I found this interesting. Like if you're hosting a celebration in your house and you don't invite your neighbor, you've committed a crime. Like in the sense, not like you, not that you'll go to jail, but like the word in Sanskrit is dandaniya, like you're deserving of punishment. You've done something, like you've violated something by doing it, you know, and you know, I don't know, I just feel like sometimes the task of like, how do we like, I don't know, like bring people together just in our life, you know, not come together to so go do something, come together to like, you know, promote a certain politician or come together to advocate for a certain policy. Just like come together and like be together, you know,
Well, I
not
kind of
like to do
dream.
something, but just to be together. You know, like
I
that I
like
feel like
dream.
is a little bit lacking, you know.
Yeah, I like dream of like a bipartisan rally just for bipartisan sake. You know what I mean? Like somehow celebrate
Yeah.
like that we're different kind of thing. So some kind of events like
Yeah.
that, you know?
Just like be together to be like and always the problem with being together or coming together I find is, you know, there's this interesting question you could ask. It's like what makes people a community, right? Like if I were to ask you what makes, I'm sorry, I'm like you know, it's kind of ironic that my camera's off here a little bit, but I'm in like a dark room right now and I don't know where the I'm in a friend's place, so I'd have to find the light switch. But I'll try to find it later and turn it on. But it's like what makes people a community? And if you ask people this question, people will be like, oh, you have a similar background, or you have a similar set of interests, or you have a similar beliefs, right? Like that's what makes you a community. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, you know, you could go take that to a conclusion and say, oh, that means community is incompatible with diversity. Like to be a community, there has to be sameness. And so it's incompatible with diversity. And like that becomes a problem. Like, can you have a community with diversity in the sense, like
Well, I think
how do
that
you
the answer is to find another
to wrap,
identity, right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that exactly. Like, and what is that? And how do we come to an agreement on that? And there was one more thing. Yeah, like how do you come together without demanding excessive conformity from anybody? So people
Right.
can be who they are, but you can still feel that you're together. That I think is a challenge. I don't know how to solve it, but I feel like that's like a deep underlying challenge that a lot of problems emanate out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'll
for
try to
sure.
find this light. Give me a second.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's there. And there are people like trying to, as you know, I mean, you know about like Bravery Angels and things like that. And there are people kind of trying to look at that. But yeah, I really, you know, yeah, this idea of somehow coming together around some other identities. I mean, maybe it's people do it a bit, I guess, a bit at things like sporting events and stuff like that. Go ahead, Dave. And then Nimai, if you have more to jump in, just jump back in. We're kind of going to wrap up here soon anyway.
So great job, David. Really great job. It's so great to see all these people and to hear everything and read the chat. Just really fantastic. This is basically what I don't want to butcher this man's name, but what he was just talking about is this type of thing. You know, David spreading his message. I kind of do it on my podcast as well, bringing everything back to the human aspect of life, not Democrat, not Republican, not Jewish or Christian or Muslim or North or South, just human aspect. At the end of the day, eliminate all these names, eliminate, you know, the political beliefs. We're human. We breathe and we bleed and all the same. So we need to keep on reminding ourselves. I think all of this that we've talked about tonight is kind of like that, you know, the frog in the hot water thing that keeps on being brought up. Like this, it's not just one thing that's happened, you know, and it's not one thing that's going to solve it. It's been the slow everyday 0.001 of raising the temperature, you know, the 50s to the 60s to the 70s. And here we are. And now we're at each other's, you know, we're supposedly at each other's throat. Supposedly there's this bias. Supposedly there's this negativity and all this other stuff. But I don't really buy into all of that. I don't deny it. I'm just saying it's been a slow thing. And this thing about community, remember years ago, Dave, we had the Jerry Lewis telethon. Remember that? And the whole country was like, I mean, for the most part, the whole country was in on it, rooting for this guy. And they were doing all these carnivals and festivals, like just to raise money for people that we don't even know. But we trusted him. We trusted that whole organization. And there is more like that. In New York State, there's no more toll booths. Thank God. We could just drive right through. But we don't even see the toll collector anymore. It's like these are just little things on and on and on that you don't. You can go to Sheets, like one of those convenience stores, and just go to a kiosk. I want to, you know, sausage, egg, and cheese. But you don't like speak to a people. Somebody just throws it at you at the end in 5 minutes. Here's your sausage, egg, and cheese. You know, give me a 5-star rating on the receipt. It's like, what? So it's just there's a long list. There's a long. He's laughing because he knows it's true. There's a long list of things that we don't do anymore together. We don't do it anymore. And it's so contrary to the fact that we have social media, because it turned out it's anti-social media.
Right.
We don't have to get together. We, you know, all of us here most likely will never be in the same room live. I mean, David, you'll eventually get famous and you'll have, you know, a big auditorium. You'll sell $50 tickets and all that stuff and VIP, and there'll be a book tour. But you know what I'm saying? It's like we don't have to get together. We have this technology, and it's ironic that the technology has gotten better, but the social interaction has gotten, I think, you know, face to face, ear to ear, mouth to ear, it's gotten less. And the solution at the end of the day, what will it be? Well, there'll be some big 5 mile wide spaceship that hovers over the planet to threaten our existence. You know, that's like a metaphor, you know, that threatens our existence. Then we'll all go, oh, guess what? I don't dislike you anymore. I dislike that thing in the sky that's going to kill me. You know what I'm saying? It's like you said, the football game, the baseball game, that's when we get together. But that's going to happen to the United States. The United States has to really feel a threat. Then we have to, play the Whitney Houston national anthem, and then we all feel good about being an American again. You know what I'm saying? It's
Well, social psychologists have sort of been telling us this for a long time, that we sort of need some sort of external threat like that. But, I don't know. The pandemic had sort of the opposite effect, and it theoretically could have been that, but it didn't have it. And I kind
no,
of think like if you tried to do something like Jerry Lewis telethon today, people would first want to find out everybody's political views before they decided they were going to support it or not, or it's like you wouldn't look at it for what it was. You would start.
right,
It seems like we start there a lot. We're always looking for everybody's
right.
political identity before we decide if we're going to like them or not.
But back in the day, that was good enough. Back in the day, Mr. Rogers was good enough. Everything was, and Sesame Street, all these things. These kids had a chance. I had a chance. I watched it. I participated in all of that naive, simple, Davy and Goliath and all that stuff, all that
Right.
innocence. And we've lost innocence. We lose innocence earlier and earlier. I'm sure back in the day it was like, oh, 15 years old, he's too old for 15. Now he's too old for 6 years old. That's whatever it is. It's too easy. It's too easy to get older fast. And there's too much information coming at you too quickly, and humans can't digest it. We can't digest. It's like overeating. We're overeating information, and we don't know how to process it. We can't sleep. Supposedly, that's a big problem. And
Well,
there's a really go ahead,
I think it was Namai was kind of talking about that, and also I think
Namaya. Thank you.
Namaya, yeah. So, oh, and Warren, this kind of fits a little bit with what you were talking about this, that things have over this, the last 50, 75 years, depending on when you want to start counting, that, and, in the interwar time, in the 30s and 20s and 30s, we saw, I think it was Young talked about this, that there was like this overall malaise among the people. And and that's kind of what it sounds like, what sounds like we're talking about right now.
That's a word I use a lot, by the way, malaise. I'm sorry, Warren, I didn't mean to step on you. But yeah, malaise. This is malaise. Crazy. Great word.
Yeah, I mean but I think there is a balance. I mean, what Travis is talking about the negativity, finding that being being acknowledging the fact that things are really good. I mean, we couldn't even have some of these arguments if things weren't good enough to have the arguments. And and I think we could have a whole conversation, or easily fill an hour or two about the stuff that Kevin was talking about. I mean, I think that was a bunch of different vectors that you could go down, a bunch of threads you could pull on, and wasn't really able to do that tonight. But I mean, that would be interesting to follow up with him and have some of that, because it brings up so many issues about sort of civic engagement and civic participation and acknowledge and awareness, and kind of just the limitations of our system itself, and it's kind of intentionally that way, and sort of that sets us up for disillusionment, because we have really high expectations, and it's really hard to get things done in our country and in our system of government, I should say.
Yeah, I think also a big problem, really big problem, if you want to get to the root cause, we need to get to the root cause, is, and it sounds silly, is America's nutrition. If you match the way things have been going in this country with the fact how we've dealt with food, it's been more the day it started to be more about shelf life, it became more about mass production and less about nutrition. You can see that us going down, civilized in a civilized way, and testosterone levels in men and all this other stuff, because it's all about mass production and it's all about shelf life. It isn't about wholesomeness and freshness. It's all about how can I make the most amount of money, and that's how you have to have something sits on the shelf for 2 months, and then this way we can mass produce it, not to make it healthy, to make it affordable, and we make money at the
Well,
same time. So
well, now you're talking about like we need to destroy capitalism, so we better not go there. So,
Well, I'm not saying that, but there is a way of doing it, and still make money. But I think that it's one of the million pieces, because it is probably a million. It could be 10,000 that all work against us and creates this outrage that we can't handle opposing opinions. We can't handle it. because we're just not healthy enough. We don't sleep enough. We're not critically prepared. There's so many ways that we're just not. We are. I like to think we are here. And by the way, interesting. Your audience today was like 99% men, and there was just a few women. It was just. I just find that that's just another interesting thing. Why is that? Why is it mostly men? Why is it mostly men at January 6th? Why is it mostly men in a lot of things except supposedly church and temple? Maybe I don't know, but that's what I hear. It's interesting. Why is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, according to, it's hard to get stats with the podcast because you don't get that, you don't get the same kind of analytics as you do with like a website. But supposedly I'm like 60-40 male to female, so I have a reasonable representation of a female. But maybe they just don't want to participate in a forum like this. So Ted, what was the intended purpose of social media, do you think, if it wasn't?
Well, I mean, don't tell, Ron DeSantis, but it was obviously, the financial aspects of what the algorithms are giving us, right? Advertising initially, and then our data, right? I mean, there's no big secret there. But what's really interesting is when you ask people what if you go back to, if you remember Facebook, I know we're using that tonight, but remember Facebook, what was the main intent of it, right? Why was it created? And it's just fascinating how many people in a quick response would say, so I could talk to my grandmother, or so that we can meet new people. But it was not an altruistic creation, right? And neither was the food pyramid, right? And talk about nutrition. Food pyramid was, collaboration or collusion or whatever language you want to use between business and government, perhaps, and certainly with interest in wanting to help people stay alive and be healthy, right? But those things aren't created with an altruistic purpose. And I think, it's unfortunate that we've moved down the road that any of these types of conversations in the mass public is automatically stamped with conspiracy theory sort of context, right? But DeHavens and others talk about how that term conspiracy theory before the last 10 years, right, was really a phrase that was used to delegitimize a position that just wasn't a popular one, right? As a purpose to subjugate those perspectives. Now, conspiracy theory, I don't think would fit in that same sort of understanding, right? It's developed far more than that. But it's not conspiracy or even maybe collusion, but it's the nature of how these things are constructed, and they're not constructed with this human sort of sense that we're humans in mind. I mean, also, if you think about Facebook itself, it was started in such an elite area where there was a easy access directory of publicly available sort of material. I mean, it's a mess. And look where, I'm not, none of this is causal, right? But I never thought we'd get here. I knew it was bad, but I never thought we'd get here. But
Yeah. Well, I think I have to wind up too here. So I do appreciate everybody participating. And yeah, it was a good conversation, a good crowd, and we had good different kind of viewpoints, which I think was good. And I would like to follow up with some of the folks too on some of the things we talked about. There's about a dozen conversations we could have and take that in a lot of different ways.
Thanks, David. It was great.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you all for showing up and participating. It was really awesome. Thank you so much. Take care.